Hello and welcome to this year's Erkenntnis lecture. Don't worry, I won't be giving it. I'm just doing the introductions. And before I do so, I have some announcements to make. First of all, after this lecture, there will be the Erkenntnis reception right outside the door with pretzels generously sponsored by Springer Erkenntnis. Drinks are on us. Second, after the Erkenntnis reception will be the Members' Assembly. The Members' Assembly, just like all colloquia that were scheduled to take place in room 2A, will actually be in here. That should be in your app, but just in case, Members' Assembly in here, colloquia scheduled for 2A will be in here too. After the Members' Assembly, and for all those who have participated in it, dinner will be served. So if you're sort of in two minds about whether or not to come to the Members' Assembly, if food is an issue, do come along. All right. That's all the announcements I have to make. And now I have the great pleasure to introduce the speaker of this year's Erkenntnis lecture, Erasmus Mayr. Don't worry, I'll be brief. Erasmus Mayr's academic trajectory took him from Munich to Oxford and back again to Bavaria, where he's been chair of practical philosophy at Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nürnberg since 2015. Among his many achievements, I will just mention the Deutscher Preis für Philosophie und Sozialethik, according to its own website, the most highly endowed prize in philosophy in all of Germany, which he received in 2021. Much more interestingly, the focus of his research. The focus of his research is neatly summarized in the title of his wonderful 2011 book, Understanding Human Agency. Erasmus's work helps us better understand how human agency works, how it fits into the natural world, why we humans act as we do, and of course, how it is that we ought to act. In addressing these questions, Erasmus, like his Renaissance namesake, shows himself to be a true polymath. Besides classic philosophy of action, he addresses issues in metaphysics, on which incidentally he's co-authored an introduction in Italian, as well as issues in ethics, on which he's published widely. He has written on the history of philosophy, in particular Kant, even Hegel, on philosophy of law, and much more. Understanding human agency, for Erasmus Mayr, is largely a matter of understanding the rational capacities that underlie it. Capacities which he has argued both to be continuous with the powers that we find in the natural world and to provide a basis for what we ought to do. Understanding Erasmus Mayr himself may also be a matter of understanding his numerous and wide-ranging rational capacities. And again, I will just give you one indication of those capacities and their impressive breadth. As some of you may know, Erasmus is fully qualified not to be an academic philosopher, but also to be a judge. Now, I have no doubt that he would have made an excellent judge, but I believe that in choosing to pursue philosophy rather than law, Erasmus Mayr did exactly what he morally ought to do. It would have been a great loss to philosophy had we not been able to benefit from his many rational capacities. Today, Erasmus will be showing us the way from capacities to ought. Oh, there wasn't a question mark when I first got the title. And discussing the prospects of a capacity-based moral constitutivism. Please join me in welcoming Erasmus Mayr to the stage.
So I hope everyone can hear me. Can everyone hear me? So as you will already have got from Barbara's very kind introduction, I'm someone who really likes capacities and powers in philosophy and who thinks that they play crucial roles in metaphysics and philosophy of action, to name just two fields. And given my sympathies for powers and capacities, I'm always very enthusiastic about finding more philosophical work for them to do. So even outside the fields of philosophy of metaphysics and philosophy of action proper. for instance, evaluative or normative work. Now, not all powers and capacities are good candidates for this. Many standard powers metaphysicians are interested in are clearly not. Think of household examples of such powers like water solubility, that a piece of sugar is water soluble, or that this water solubility is manifested because the sugar dissolves in water, doesn't seem to bring with it any evaluative or normative standards. In and of themselves, the possession or manifestations of water solubility are neither good or bad, correct nor incorrect. Such powers are possessed or not, manifested or not, end of story. Indirectly, of course, they may have an impact on what we should believe or what we should do, but this impact depends on the existence of other independent standards about what we should do and believe. But there is one subclass of powers or capacities for which the prospects of explaining evaluative or normative standards seem to be considerably better, namely personal or agential capacities. That is, capacities that only persons or agents can have, and whose possession and exercise is part and parcel of our rational lives. So, for instance, the capacities to form beliefs, for practical deliberation, for perception, for self-reflection. But also more specific capacities, such as the capacity to calculate, to speak German, or to play the piano. Labels for this more restricted set of capacities vary. Sometimes they are called rational capacities, sometimes competences or abilities, and I will use all these three labels more or less interchangeably in the following. A key feature of many such abilities is that they seem to come with an inbuilt standard for successful or correct exercise. That is, with a standard that allows not just for the distinction between exercise versus non-exercise, but with a standard for distinguishing a correct or successful exercise from an incorrect or unsuccessful one. When I exercise, say, my capacity to do calculations, things can go wrong. I can miscalculate. Miscalculating is a form of calculating. It is different from not calculating at all. But it is incorrect calculating. In order to understand what the capacity for calculation is, one must also understand this difference between correct exercise versus incorrect exercise. That at least is the natural idea. And it seems to open the door for a kind of evaluation or normativity which comes simply from exercising abilities. Certain such standards seem to apply to our exercises of abilities just in virtue of there being exercises of these abilities. That is, when I'm exercising my ability to calculate, the standards of what counts as correct calculation necessarily apply to what I'm doing. And this feature of abilities makes it worthwhile to look at them when one is interested in the sources of normativity, to use the title of a well-known book by Christine Korsgaard. If you are of an extremely optimistic philosophical temperament, which I'm not, but if you are, you may even hope that this feature provides a way to derive an ought from an is, so to speak, and to Kant is a question mark in the title. For it may appear that just from facts about the nature of an ability and from the fact that the ability is exercised, you can get to some normative result. But let's not ask for the moon. What I want to do here is something much more modest. I want just to look at what rational capacities can contribute to one very prominent project in contemporary moral philosophy, namely the project of constitutivism. And constitutivism tries to explain why we are subject to certain principles by understanding them as constitutive standards of activities we are engaged in. So I'll say more about that in a minute. Don't worry if you don't know, haven't heard about it yet. Rational capacities are sometimes appealed to by constitutivist philosophers, but the real potential of an appeal to such capacities for constitutivism has, in my view, not yet been sufficiently appreciated. And I want to argue here that a capacity-based view of constitutivism is, in fact, the best version of constitutivism. And this is a version which takes the relevant principles to be or derive from constitutive standards for abilities and their exercises. And to make things a bit easier here, I will just focus on practical principles in the following. So this is only from principles for action and practical deliberation. And I try to make like a two-pronged case for the constitutivism cum capacities package, which I'm trying to sell you, or no, which I'm at least advertising, by looking at the two most discussed problems for constitutivism. First, David Enoch's schmagency objection, and second, the so-called bad action or normativity problem. I will argue that a capacity-based constitutivism offers particularly promising answers to both problems. And for the second problem, this will require a brief look into the metaphysics of abilities. So I will proceed, or my positive argument will proceed in 3 steps. I will look at Enoch's schmagency objection, look at the bad action or normativity problem, and lastly, look at what a plausible account of the metaphysics of abilities must look like in order to allow us to answer both these problems, especially the second one. And what my considerations will begin to show, I hope, or at least will suggest, is that a capacity-based constitutivism is the most promising form of constitutivism when it comes to beings like us humans, because it best fits our nature as finite, fallible beings who have limited capacities and who can, alas, never be sure to get things right. Okay, before I start with, so to speak, my promotion of the constitutivism cum capacities package, I will say something about what constitutivism is, or rather, what the kind of constitutivism is that I'm interested in here. So it's not the only form, but the most prominent one. And I apologize to all who know the debates for boring them a bit now. Well, perhaps not just now, but especially now. Constitutivists of the stripes want to explain why certain principles and standards, and especially certain practical principles and standards, are normatively binding for us, have normative authority over us, and do so necessarily and unconditionally, whatever our aims, desires, or preferences are. So that we do something wrong when we act contrary to these principles, regardless of whether we care about them, and regardless of what our desires, aims, and preferences are. This kind of normative bindingness or authority is often called categorical authority. It's a clear reference to Kant, obviously. Which practical principles might have such categorical authority? 2 sorts are usually considered. Principles of instrumental reasoning, so that you should not at the same time have an end and refuse to take the necessary means for reaching it. And moral principles, so for Kantians, typically something like the categorical imperative. How can we explain that such principles are normatively binding for us in a categorical way? Constitutivists suggest a general scheme for this explanation. They propose that we should view these principles as constitutive principles of agency, or principles which derive from constitutive features what it is to be an agent. And what they mean by agency is normally intentional agency. Constitutive standards are standards which, as Korsgaard puts it, apply to a thing simply in virtue of its being the kind of thing it is. Constitutive standards for doing X automatically have at least a hedged or conditional normative force for those who are engaged in doing X. Just in virtue of doing X, or of being engaged in doing X, the agent stands under this restricted normative authority because her activity will necessarily count as a bad or defective instant of that kind, as a bad qua Xing, if it doesn't meet the standard. And constitutive thinks that this restricted normative force becomes an unconditional normative force if being an X, or being engaged in doing X, is in a relevant sense necessary or unavoidable for the person in question. And they think that being an agent or acting intentionally are necessary or unavoidable for us in the relevant way. So roughly, the constitutive argument has the following 3 steps. So first, that constitutive standards for an activity have ipso facto at least restricted normative authority, for they determine whether this activity is good qua Xing or correct qua Xing. Second, when engaging in this activity is unavoidable for an agent, this restricted normative force becomes unconditional. Third, being an agent or engaging in agency is unavoidable for us. Therefore, the constitutive standards for agency or for being agents are principles with unconditional normative force for us. And the most famous development of this explanatory scheme is, of course, Christine Korsgaard's project in her book Self-Constitution. So she believes that acting is unavoidable for us, is our plight, and therefore she thinks that somehow the principles for agency, which she thinks are the principle of self-constitution, are normatively binding on us, and that we can get to the categorical imperative in this way. But I'm not interested here in Korsgaard's specific version, but just in this general explanatory scheme. Let me perhaps also say a bit about each step of the scheme. So one, as already noted, constitutive standards are standards which apply to something simply in virtue of the kind of thing it is. So if S is a constitutive standard for X, then if we understand X's nature, we also understand that anything which is an X can sensibly evaluate it according to whether it accords with S. And qua X, there will be something wrong with it if it doesn't. This idea perhaps at first sounds a bit esoteric, but it is really quite familiar from many different fields of philosophy. So for instance, many philosophers think truth is a constitutive aim of belief, which an epistemic state aims at just in virtue of being a belief. If it fails to achieve this aim, if it is false, then it is bad or deficient qua belief. It's a very common idea. Or to move to the field of action, when you are participating in a game of football, you are, by this fact, somehow subject to the rules of football. There is something wrong with what you are doing, insofar as it's considered as a football move, if you carry the ball into the opponent's goals with your hands. There are constitutive standards for very different categories of things. So there are constitutive standards for substances, for mental states, for activities or actions, and also for abilities. And it is most natural to think of constitutive standard for abilities as the standards which determine what counts as the characteristic or defining exercise or manifestation of this ability. So it is the kind of activity which the ability is an ability to do or a power for. So depending on the ability, these will be the standards which determine what counts as a genuine or correct or successful manifestation or exercise of this ability. So for instance, when you have the ability to sing the Marseillaise by heart, the activity which defines its nature is singing the Marseillaise by heart correctly. Unless you can do that, you don't have the ability in question. I have it. The idea of constitutive standards gets us, it is hoped, from the metaphysics of being an X to a kind of scope-restricted or hedged evaluation about whether something is good or bad qua X. Sometimes this evaluation is just made from the outside. So when we judge whether a knife is a good instance of its kind, it's whether it's good qua knife. But constitutivists think that when it comes to the constitutive standards for activities which agents engage in, things are different. They think that then the agents engaging in these activities are themselves committed to these standards. And these standards must guide what these agents are doing. And the underlying idea is that in virtue of engaging in this activity, you somehow commit yourself to these standards. Why should this be true? Well, I think the point can best be brought out, if it can be brought out at all, I think it can best be brought out by reading engaging as intentionally engaging. So I can only be playing football intentionally if I have some understanding of what playing football is. If the latter includes that the activity is subject to certain constitutive standards, then I must also understand that what I'm doing when I play is subject to these standards. And this seems to involve a form of commitment that my actions on the fields are subject to the rules of football. And this commitment, the constitutivist argument goes, introduces some, albeit still qualified, normative pressure on the agent to comply with the standards. So if all goes well, step one gets us from the metaphysics of being an X to a conditional, hedged kind of normativity. Now for step two, so I'll be much briefer. However, so far, this normativity is only a hedged conditional one. So when, while playing football, you carry the ball into your opponent's goal by hand, then doing so needn't be bad or false overall, clearly. And it's not just that it needn't be bad, all things considered. Maybe by breaking the rules, you can achieve some wonderful result. No, it's even that you may not have good reason at all not to carry the ball with the hands. Even when doing so is false qua a football playing move. For instance, you may at this moment not be engaged in playing football, or you may just want to exit the game. Perhaps you are just signaling that the game is over, and therefore take the ball into your hands. So the fact that in playing football, you make a mistake qua football player when you take the ball into your hands, certainly doesn't mean that you are under any categorical requirement not to do so. And constitutivists offer a second step, which they hope gets them from this kind of hedged conditional authority to something like unconditional, categorical, normative authority. And this step is meant to be achieved by the idea that some activities are unavoidable for us. We are always necessarily engaged with them. And for this reason, we are always committed to the constitutive standards. And thus we can drop the restriction insofar as you are an X in the statement about goodness or corrections in those cases, because the relevant condition is necessarily met. Step 3, we already had this, is that agency is unavoidable for us, or inescapable for us. We cannot help being agents, constitutivists insist, and we cannot help being engaged in acting. At least in the sense that we cannot opt out of agency directly. So for even committing suicide, I think, would itself be a form of action at first, would be something we do. So other relevant forms for inescapability have also been claimed for agency, but let's see aside here. And therefore, the constitutivist standards for being an agent, to which we are committed in virtue of being agents, are unconditionally binding on us. So that's very, very roughly the constitutivist argument. One should note that the normative authority of practical principles we get at in the end of this argument still has its limits. So even if successful, this argument doesn't show that we should never violate these principles overall, or that it will always be wrong or things considered to violate these principles. It will only be the case that in violating these principles, we act against some principle we are committed to. But still, this would be a far from trivial result, because it would show that there is necessarily some normative pressure to act in accordance with these principles. And this would still be quite nice. Okay, so much for this rough sketch of the explanatory scheme which constitutivism offers. Let us now turn to the most common objections. So many philosophers think the scheme is unsound, and unsound not just for one particular practical principle, but in general, that it cannot deliver anything like unconditional normative authority. And the best form of skepticism concerns the step from the hedged normativity, this qua-normativity, qua-ex-normativity, to something like unconditional and non-hedged normativity. And to have a good label for this latter thing, I will call it normativity sans phrase. So the skepticism really concerns the step from something being bad qua-ex or incorrect qua-ex to the existence of any real normative pressure to avoid this or not to act accordingly. And the most famous version of the skepticism, as many of you will know, is David Enoch's Schmagency objection. As Enoch argues, even when we realize that something is a constitutive standard for agency, we may still consider the standard as completely normatively arbitrary, even so when acting is unavoidable for us. And Enoch famously brings this out by imagining a person, we can call it a would-be Schmagent, who admits that some standard or aim is constitutive for action. So she admits that self-constitution is somehow constitutive for action, which is Korsgaard's view. But the would-be Schmagent is perfectly willing to abandon or not to engage in the project of self-constitution because she does not care about being an agent. She is perfectly happy to be a Schmagent instead, someone just like an agent, apart from not sharing the aim of self-constitution. And the worst the constitutivists can say to such a person, Enoch thinks, is that then her behavior would not count as acting. could not be classified as acting. But this classification thread seems a fairly empty one. I mean, this doesn't seem to have any normative oomph. The constitutivist, Enoch says, has no real response to this would-be Schmähchen. The mere fact that agency is unavoidable for us doesn't provide such a response. Even when I find myself unavoidably and inescapably engaged in some activity, I don't therefore have to accept its constitutive standards or their normative authority. So Enoch's own case is that I find myself unavoidably playing chess. I have some chess-playing compulsion. And still, Enoch says, I can play it, as he says, under protest, without accepting the aims purportedly constitutive of this game. So, or perhaps I even regard an activity which I cannot get out of as normatively unacceptable, very bad, and as one I should perform as badly in as I can. Under such circumstances, there seems nothing wrong or irrational with trying to make as many false moves as possible when playing chess. So what the would-be Schmähchen figure brings out is that the combination of constitutive standards plus unavoidability doesn't add up to unconditional normative force, because it cannot rule out that the standards are normatively arbitrary. Now, as many of you will know, this Schmähchen objection has created, well, we want to say, libraries of discussions. And it would be, of course, utterly pointless to go into the ramifications of the debate here. And as I guess many of you also know, that a great number of philosophers think that somehow the would-be Schmähchen's position cannot be coherently formulated at all, or at least cannot be formulated in a way that it really raises a challenge for the constitutive rules of agency. And I actually think something like this is true. But I also think it doesn't really matter, because I think there is a perfectly good underlying problem here, which constitutivists should take seriously. And this worry underlying Enoch's argument is simply that the constitutivist argument doesn't show how we get from the hedged qua-ex normativity, which constitutive standards give rise to something like genuine normative pressure. So it doesn't simply explain how we get from incorrect as a calculation to our being under some normative pressure to avoid this. It is true that if I were to be just speaking in German, failure to comply with the rules of German grammar makes the resulting sentence false as a sentence of German. And it's also true that the standards for speaking German necessarily apply to what I'm saying when I'm just speaking in German. But this applying only means that it makes sense to check whether my utterances accord with the rules of German. But for instance, it wouldn't make sense to check whether they accord with the rules of French when I'm not speaking French. It would just be pointless. But this, that they apply simply doesn't mean that any truly evaluative or normative consequences follow from the result of this checking or from my compliance or non-compliance. And I think it's important to see that not even conditional evaluation or normativity follow from such applicability. It is not even something like it would be good or required to do if I were or when I am engaged in speaking German. Even when the latter condition is met, we still only get the hedged evaluation or normativity of correct qua utterance in German. We just cannot get rid of this qualification. And so the case is very much different from what we have when we look at a statement like, if I've made a promise to do X, I should do X. So in this latter case, if I add the premise that I have made a promise to do X, then I can infer that I should, sans phrase, do X. But the hedged normativity in correct qua X is just not like that. And I think Enoch just means that it is not a kind of normativity at all. Perhaps it's something which can be turned into normativity by adding a further normative premise. And so I think we can really rephrase Enoch's complaint as follows. So he thinks that the constitutivist argument implicitly treats hedged qua X normativity as if it were just a form of conditional normativity. And if this were the correct understanding of qua X normativity, indeed, unavoidability of these activities would help us towards unconditional and categorical normative authority. But hedged qua normativity is just different from conditional normativity. And so the step from qua X normativity to real normativity to normativity sans phrase is still not done. And this, I think, is a perfectly good and valid puzzle, which remains, even if perhaps you think, and I think you might rightly think, that this would-be agent is perhaps not the best way to bring it out. And so really the question is whether constitutivists can provide a positive story about the normative authority of practical principles that doesn't leave us with this explanatory puzzle. How to get from this hedged normativity to normativity sans phrase. And I think they can, and this brings me to the capacity-based version of constitutivism, which I'm like advertising here. And this is a version of constitutivism which takes the relevant practical principles to be constitutive standards for rational capacities and the exercises. So principles which determine what counts as an exercise or the correct exercise. And doing so opens, I think, a new line of approach to explaining the normative authority of practical principles. Now, at first, the suggestion may sound a bit surprising, because abilities, first and foremost, determine what we can do. They do not directly determine what we should do or what would be good to do. So, I mean, of course, when you look at the constitutive standards for capacities, which determine when exercise is correct or successful, they also bring in a kind of hedged, correct, qua-ex or qua-exercise of this capacity normativity. But this kind of hedged normativity doesn't help us here, because our puzzle is exactly how to get from the hedged qua-ex normativity to normativity sans phrase. But as we all know, which abilities we have is often highly relevant for what we should do. Abilities circumscribe the space of things we can do and the ways how we can do things. And this is not only relevant for things like the auto-implies can principle, obviously. In addition, and fairly trivially, when a certain things needs to be done, our abilities typically give rise to constraints to how we can do it. We can only do it in certain ways, given our abilities. These constraints become requirements on us if the thing in question is to be done at all. So if, say, I have to cross a river at this moment, and the only way to do so is by exercising my ability to swim, then I had better exercise the ability. And then I had better comply with the constitutive standards for this ability. Otherwise, I will never get to the other side. This type of explanation for why we should do something is, I take it, very perfectly familiar. It rests on combining constitutive standards for abilities and the fact that there is no alternative to using these abilities when something is to be done. But how can this get us anything like the categorical, unconditional normative authority which constitutivists are after? Is not the story about swimming, which I just told you, just a case of humdrum instrumental justification? I mean, at least it clearly shares the letter structure of deriving requirements from the already presupposed starting point that something is to be done or something I have to do. And how can such reasoning generate anything more than conditional normative conclusions at best, in the best case? But very conveniently, we find in Korsgaard's own work an idea which we can very naturally use with some adaptations to turn this into an explanation of unconditional categorical normative authority. And this idea connects normativity to problem solving, and actually it figures quite prominently in the argument in the sources of normativity, while not so in self-constitution. So in the sources of normativity, Korsgaard emphasizes that agency is our plight in a slightly different sense from the one which is predominant in self-constitution. Namely, not primarily in the sense that we cannot avoid acting, but rather in the sense that we human beings are presented with a problem, the problem of what we should do. We are animals with the capacity to form intentions and act on them, and we are capable of self-reflection, which enables us, Korsgaard says, to turn our attention to our own mental activities, to distance ourselves from them, and to call them into question. Because we have these capacities, what we do is not directly determined by our desires and impulses. For any given desire or impulse, we can step back and ask whether we should act on it. Only when we see good enough reasons for doing so, we can give a positive answer to this question and commit to acting, to going forward. So on this picture, there is a practical problem we face in virtue of our capacities. The problem presented by the question, what should I do, which we need to answer. Only because we are capable of self-reflection and of forming intention, so on the basis of deliberation, the question, what should I do, arises for us as a practical question. And Korsgaard also thinks that once we have these capacities, it necessarily arises for us. So in this sense, it is the plight, our plight, that we are faced with this problem. Now assume that you are faced with a problem, one you accept to be a real life problem, and you find that there's just one possible solution to it. Then this is normatively relevant for you. The solution is one you should adopt, if it is the only answer to the problem you have. And Korsgaard, at least when she was writing The Source of Normativity, thought something like this was the general way to explain the normative authority of practical and moral claims. She thought their normative force is established in this way. If you recognize the problem to be real, to be yours, to be one you have to solve, and the solution to be the only or the best one, then the solution is binding upon you. So she thought the normative authority of the solution is derived from the reality of the problem. Now combine this with Korsgaard's previous point that our agency inexorably presents us with a problem. Namely that given our rational capacities, we are faced with the problem of what we should do. In consequence, if we were to find there is just one possible or one best solution to this problem, so one possible or only one best answer to the question of what we should do, this answer is binding on us and we should act accordingly. And it will also be categorically binding because the problem is one we are necessarily, inexorably faced with. Now, Korsgaard's own formulation is tailored to the case where there is only one or one best solution to the practical problem. Now, the formulation, the best solution, is a bit dodgy because it seems to import some further evaluative standard. So let's focus on the only one solution alternative. When the relevant problem is being faced with the question, what should I do? I think the case where there's just one possible answer is fairly exceptional. Normally, there are many different things we can licitly do, our practical principles leaving open several options. But it may still be true that there are constraints on any possible answer to this question, on anything which can count as a possible solution to this problem that we can arrive at. Then we can apply Korsgaard's point to these constraints too. These constraints will translate into normative requirements for us because meeting them is necessary for finding a solution to our initial problem. And our initial problem is a real one, a live one for us. Now, where could such constraints or requirements come from? And I think there are two main sources. On the one hand, from the nature of the problem we are faced with. And so Korsgaard clearly thinks that the problem of what to do arises for us in a special form. One is a practical problem, such that an answer must settle what we do. And second, that the answer must be one we can reflectively accept or endorse. On the other hand, such requirements come from the resources we have available to find an answer to this problem. And these are, first and foremost, our rational capacities. We only have some certain capacities at our disposal for solving the problem, for we are finite human beings. So, for instance, in order to solve the question of what to do in a way that the answer settles what we do and is acceptable to us under reflection, we must exercise our capacities for deliberation and self-reflection. We cannot just wait for a magical intuition to pop up and tell us what to do. We are not built the way that this would be a feasible route to get to a solution. But if we must exercise certain capacities in order to find a solution, and if there are constitutive standards for these capacities, then we must follow these standards in order to solve the problem. Otherwise, we are stuck with it. And now, according to a capacity-based constitutivism, practical principles which have categorical authority are just the constitutive standards for rational capacities we must use in order to solve the what I should do question. And I mean, this is slightly different from Korsgaard's suggestion, as you'll note, because she was focusing on the solutions themselves. And so on the capacity-based version of constitutivism, the normative authority of practical principles derives from two factors. On the one hand, from the reality of the problem we are inexorably faced with and the need to answer it. On the other hand, from facts about what solving this problem requires or presupposes. And this depends mainly on the capacities we have. If a solution is to be reached at all, no matter what it may be in detail, we have to follow the constitutive standards for exercising the rational capacities we must use. Now, we may not be happy about this, so we might rather not have the problem or have better or other capacities and deplore that we are stuck with the capacities we have. But alas, it does not help whining. We had better resign ourselves and use what we have got and get on with the job. Otherwise, the problem will never be solved. And I think this kind of story provides a fairly, you might say, down-to-earth explanation of the normative authority of practical principles in terms of the constitutive standards for essential capacities. And this story does not commit us to the claim that agency is unavoidable for us. It is compatible with it, but doesn't commit us to it. Instead, the two kinds of unavoidabilities the story rests on are the following: that the problem, what should I do, is unavoidable for us, and that we must use just rational capacities as those for deliberation and reflection in order to solve it. And let me briefly say a word about each of these two unavoidabilities or inescapabilities in turn. So first, the supposed unavoidability of the problem, what I should do. Are we always really faced with this problem? I mean, surely not, you may think we are asleep, but whenever we are awake and able to act, I think we at least implicitly admit the force of this problem. And we accept that we have this problem even when we don't explicitly think about it. So for instance, when we, are engaged in routine activities where it's obvious what we will do next, then we don't explicitly address this problem. But I think even then, there is a standing acceptance on our part that the question, should you do this, or afterward, should you have done this, is a legitimate one to ask. And I think when we become adults and develop our capacities for reflection and deliberation, we just come to accept that this is a generally legitimate question, and one which is, in the sense, inescapable for us. Sorry, oops. Now, even if you agree with this, you may think that such general acceptance of the question isn't enough to avoid normative arbitrariness. So if you remember Enoch's agency objection, you may argue, unless we have reasons to take this problem seriously and to care about finding a solution for it, it might just be okay to ignore it. And then the fact that something was necessary for solving this problem need not be relevant for us. Ensuring its normative relevance, you may think, requires some additional story about why we have to accept this as a problem and why solving it matters. However, it doesn't seem to me that this kind of skepticism about the what should I do problem really gets off the ground. And it is not only that figures like Enoch's would-be Schmädchen obviously care about the what should I do problem, and so that it's dialectically appropriate to presuppose the reality of the problem. It also seems that the problem about what we should do is in a way self-validating. If you take yourself to have a problem of the sort, you do really have a problem of the sort. So maybe not exactly the same problem as the one you thought you had at the start. So imagine that you think you have been wronged by someone and you want to wreak revenge and wonder whether you should do this by asking a particularly nasty question in a Q&A session in order to take revenge. So I hope that's not true for any of you. But still imagine it's like that. So you take yourself to be faced with this later problem, should I ask this really nasty question in order to take revenge? It is certainly true that in this case, you have a problem about what you should do. And this is true even if maybe you shouldn't ponder exactly the question of whether you should take revenge in that way, in that particular way, in the first place. For instance, because you haven't been wronged, or you shouldn't take revenge at all. Even then, just facing the original question presents you with a completely real problem of what you should do when you have a desire to take revenge in that way. So even if the first what should I do question may not be the one you should ponder, there is always another what should I do question which you are really faced with. And so the general what should I do question is one we are not only always faced with, but one which always presents us with a real problem, once we take it to present us with a real problem. So alas, taking yourself to have a what should I do problem is one of these self-validating things. When you think that, you indeed have a problem about what you should do. Okay, so much for the first kind of unavoidability, the unavoidability of the problem. Now briefly to the second kind of unavoidability, that we don't have any other resources for solving the problem, but to use rational capacities such as those for deliberation and reflection. And this is quite a substantial kind of no alternatives claim, which of course I cannot fully defend here, but I just want to point to one consideration of its favor. Because if Korsgaard's story is true about how the normative question arises, this what should I do question arises, it only arises because we possess and exercise capacities for deliberation and reflection. And it's hardly implausible that these capacities, which are already needed for forming the question, are also needed for answering the question. So, for instance, remember, the problem is to find an answer to the what should I do question, which we can on reflection accept. I can hardly determine whether I have arrived at such an answer without exercising my capacity for reflection, if only in order to tell whether now I have a real answer to this question. But let's leave this point here. So the resulting question of constitutivism, I think, provides us with a fairly promising answer to the Enoch-style worry about the viability of the constitutivist explanatory scheme. There are unconditionally binding practical principles because we have the rational capacities we have. On the one hand, these capacities unavoidably give rise to a certain problem. On the other hand, they determine what we can do to address it. Since we must use these capacities to find a solution to the problem, the constitutive standards for these capacities are normatively authoritative for us. They are practical principles whose authority we cannot escape. And their authority is categorical because it is one we are subject to just in virtue of being agents and of having the kind of rational capacities we have. And this, I think, is this mechanism which gets you from incorrect qua X to normativity simplicity. Okay. Now I will not make the joke, this was the first half because the next part is much shorter. So that was the first part of my pitch for the constitutivism-abilities combination. So it opens the route, I think, to an attractive, fairly down-to-earth answer to the main objection to the constitutivist project. But I think this combination brings further important resources to the constitutivist project, and inter alia for addressing the second standard objections to it, which is often discussed under the label the bad action problem. And this worry concerns the question of whether constitutive principles can really be normative principles themselves, and even when they are combined with a positive story like the one I just offered. For contrary to appearances, the worry goes, these principles don't even give rise to hedge normativity qua X. And the key idea is kind of fairly simple. It is that a standard can only be normative if you can, in principle, comply or deviate from it. If anything whatsoever counts as complying with the standard, or if nothing counts as deviating from it, there is no normativity. You don't even have normativity qua X, or something bad or correct qua X. But how should this work for supposedly constitutive normative standards, which should apply to us in virtue of being engaged in agency? And a very simple line of thought seems to exclude the possibility of deviation here in principle. Either we comply with these standards, and then we are engaged in these activities and all is fine, or we don't comply with them, but then, ipso facto, we are not engaged in this activity. And then, contrary to original appearances, the standards don't apply to what we are doing after all, since the application rested on our putative engagement with the activity. And so we seem to be left with no logical space for the possibility of failing to comply with constitutive standards. Because once we make a mistake, we already get out of their scope, as it were. And so these standards cannot be normative. And this problem, or one especially prominent version of it, is often called the bad action problem. And it's easy to see why when you think of Korsgaard's versions of constitutivism. So she thinks you are meant to be subject to the constitutive norms of agency because you're an agent. And complying with them is necessary for self-constitution and thus for being an agent. If you don't comply with these norms and act badly, you don't constitute yourself. But then you are no longer an agent. You no longer act. And then the basis for being subject to these norms vanishes as well. So it seems you haven't acted badly after all. You haven't acted at all. Now, fortunately, the capacity-based constitutivism, which I've been supposing, clearly allows for the possibility of bad action. So remember that this constitutivism doesn't rely on the claims that agency itself is inescapable, but on the claim that as agents, we are faced with a certain problem and have only certain capacities for solving it. Nothing in the story entails that when you fail to exercise the capacities needed for solving the problem, you also fail to act or fail to be an agent, and the problem in question thereby disappears. In the fact, this is quite implausible considering the details of the story. So the relevant problem is, remember, the problem to solve the question, what should I do, in a way that settles what we do and is one you can reflectively endorse. Unless you exercise your capacity for self-reflection, we may assume, you won't arrive at an answer to this problem, because the point of whether you can self-reflectively endorse your solution remains open. But exercising your capacity for reflection may not always be necessary for acting. Maybe you sometimes can form an intention completely spontaneously and act on it without reflection. So, and imagine now that you form a completely spontaneous intention whose formation is incompatible with some practical principles. Then you act, but in acting you fail to solve the problem that you faced with in virtue of being an agent. Your apparent answer to the problem is not a real answer at all, and the original problem remains unsolved. So it is clearly possible on this version of constitutivism to act wrongly and still to act. That's reassuring, but you may think that's not really enough to show that constitutive standard for abilities can be normative with regard to the exercises of these abilities. Because you may think, and many people would argue, that this requires that these principles can at least in principle guide you in the exercise of these capacities. But this requires that they allow us to distinguish between correct and incorrect, successful and unsuccessful exercises of an ability. And can we really make sense of that? So can we make sense of the idea that an ability is exercised, but that it is only exercised incorrectly, erroneously, and that it fails to meet this constitutive standard? And I take it that for many constitutive standards, we cannot make sense of the idea. So some standards are simply such that you must comply with them in order to count as engaged in this activity or as exercising this ability at all. So take singing, for instance. So producing some sounds is necessarily part of and parcel of singing. If you produce no sounds, you are not singing at all. But so the principles, when you are singing, you should be making some sounds. If you understand that as a constitutive norm and constitutive standard for the ability to sing, this cannot be a normative principle at all. Because you cannot fail to comply with it when you exercise the ability. Either you are singing, but then you are already making some sounds, or you're not making any sounds, but then you are not singing. And so the constitutive principles for singing don't apply to what you're doing. However, not all constitutive standards are such non-normative ones, at least on the face of it. So remember the capacities I mentioned at the start of the talk, such as the capacity for calculating, where you have a standard for calculating correctly. Meeting the standard is not necessary for exercising your ability to calculate, because you can make mistakes. But it is a standard which necessarily applies to your calculation when you are calculating. And these, I think, are the standards which are the best candidates for both constitutive and truly normative standards. But can there be such standards? And to answer this question, and now I come to the last part of my talk, we must delve a bit into the metaphysics of abilities and the exercise. But I think I'm still kind of doing right for time. Is it? You look very surprised, right? And And I think there's one significant and fairly well-known obstacle to making sense of such standards. And this comes from a fairly natural understanding of the exercise of abilities, which in turn derives from a fairly natural understanding of the exercise or manifestation of powers in general. So assume a piece of sugar has the power to dissolve in water. When is this power exercised or manifested? And a very natural answer is when and only when the piece of sugar actually dissolves in water, i.e. when the kind of thing, the kind of change or activity occurs which the power is a power for. And many philosophers, I take it, regard this as a trivial truth. So we say, what else could a manifestation be? Now, when we apply this point to abilities, we get that abilities to do X are manifested only when the agent does X. Now, take the ability to do large sum calculations correctly. Then this means that this must be a different ability from the ability which is manifested when I calculate large sums and make a mistake. I mean, such a latter ability would be just the ability to do large sum calculations, but not the ability to do large sum calculations correctly. And the range of activities in which these abilities are exercised differs, because the one is not exercised when I make a false calculation, while the other isn't. And so these must be different abilities. And this means that also the ability to do X and the ability to do X correctly turn out to be different abilities. And this unfortunately suggests that all constitutive standards for ability exercise which look normative are really non-normative constitutive standards for the exercise of a different ability. So it looked like a normative standard for calculation, showing us when a calculation is correct, but really it's a standard for a different ability, namely the ability to calculate correctly. But if this were true, we could not make sense of genuine constitutive standards for ability exercise, which are also normative. We would be stuck with the view that a capacity is either exercised or not, and without any possibility that when it is exercised, this exercise can be either correct or not. And to make room for genuinely normative constitutive principles for abilities, we must consider abilities such as the ability for calculating and the ability for calculating correctly to be the numerically same identities. This must be one and the same ability. And actually, I think this is an eminently plausible view, because correct calculation and incorrect calculation are not different activities, and they don't involve manifestations of different abilities. Because we couldn't even understand what calculation is without also understanding that there is a standard for correctness for calculation. Without this connection, calculation just wouldn't be the kind of activity it is. When you are calculating, your behavior must reflect at least an implicit grasp of this difference, must at least reflect an implicit grasp of the fact that sometimes the calculation is correct, sometimes not. So imagine that you just say numbers in answer to calculation problems and show no ability or tendency to revise or at least review your answer when given very strong reasons to believe that what you said was false. Then what you are doing just isn't calculating. It's something else. It's just blindly following a hunch. Whenever you intentionally engage in a calculation, this must come with an implicit understanding that there are things like mistakes in calculation. And it must also come with some ability for and tendency towards correction when required. Without the latter, we either couldn't ascribe the ability to calculate to you, or we could not consider this capacity to be exercised on this occasion. There is no exercise of the ability to calculate, which is not to some degree responsive to correctness considerations. And furthermore, the manifestation of this responsiveness, so when you actually check your result in light of reasons to doubt that you got it right the first time, this responsiveness is itself part of the exercise of your ability to calculate. You are still calculating when you check incorrect. And something similar is true for many other abilities as well. Since checking for faults and corrections are themselves parts of the exercise of your ability to calculate, there are exercises of this ability which are mistaken or incorrect. So for instance, when you have first got the wrong result, but the process of review and checking ends before you arrive at the correct result. Because of this, what you do can both be an exercise of your ability to calculate and still fail to get what this exercise is directed at. And this explains the normative character of at least some constitutive standards. Now, I ended with the question whether there is a plausible account of the metaphysics of abilities which allows for this, which allows for the possibility of incorrect or unsuccessful exercise of abilities, and which takes the exercise of such abilities to include checking and correction, or some tendency to it, as such that this exercise must reflect some grasp of the correct versus incorrect distinction. And I do think there is one. It is the view of abilities as essentially adaptive powers, which takes the ability to do X to include a bundle of other powers which are conducive to or necessary for doing X successfully or correctly. And this is, in fact, a view about abilities Barbara Vetter and I have recently defended. For the ability to calculate, say, this includes not only powers to get the right answers for calculations, but also, e.g., powers to review your results, to check or correct them when required. For other abilities, such as the ability to swim, it also includes the ability for taking different means when circumstances change, for instance, when the current changes, and so on. Exercise of an ability requires, on this view, that enough of these component powers are manifested. And this enough must be sufficient for the exercise to display at least an implicit grasp of this distinction between correct versus incorrect exercise. But importantly, it need not include actually getting to the correct result. So when the question is 2 plus 4, an exercise of the ability to calculate need not include that you give the result 6. Even when you arrive at the wrong answer 7, you do exercise your ability to calculate on this occasion, as long as you are sufficiently responsive to possible considerations concerning the calculation's correctness. Now, unsurprisingly, I find this conception of abilities and the exercises to be independently attractive, because I think it accords very well with the fact that we humans are fallible agents, that we are not guaranteed to get things right on the first attempt. So our abilities better had include powers for reviewing and correcting results. And since we are not omnipotent and have to act under changing circumstances, we had better be able to change our course of action when required. Otherwise, we wouldn't get very far. And the exercise of these abilities had better be such that they include some revising or checking, at least when required. And in fact, the rationale for understanding abilities in this way is fundamentally the same one as the one on which my first pitch for the capacity-based version of constitutivism was based. It is insight into, now there comes these deep statements, into our limitations as human beings. And this insight makes it not only plausible to view abilities in a suggested way, because they are the abilities of human beings, so they had better fit our basic features. At the same time, this insight is what makes appeal to constitutive features of abilities so appropriate in explaining the normative authority of practical principles. For we simply have no choice but to rely on these abilities in solving the problems we have. So there is good reason to think that capacity-based constitutivism is just the form of constitutivism best suited to explaining the normative authority of practical principles for us, fallible and finite beings. And with this, I'll end.
Thank you, Erasmus. Okay, everyone can hear me. We now have we have exactly 22 minutes for questions because we have to be out of the room in time. Please raise your hand sort of visibly for me if you have a question, and leave it up until I nod at you or call on you, and I will just start. And also you will get a microphone to ask your question, so please wait for the microphone. And I will start with Eva Schmidt, who's right there in the middle of what's on my left side. And everybody else, please keep your hands up.
Thank you. Yeah, this was really cool. So I was wondering, this idea that played a role, I think, in your argument as well, that we kind of can't help using these abilities, so it's kind of inescapable. I was wondering, in what respect is this better than something I think that psychologists know more about than me, is like this idea, well, I'm stuck with this government, or our future, we're just stuck with having AI systems taking over everything. So therefore it's right that this goes this way. Don't you have the same problem?
Thank you very much. So I think the main difference is that we are not simply stuck with these capacities, but we also see that these are the ones we must use to solve this problem. So I think that is the difference. So it's not just that we cannot help exercising these capacities. I think if it were just like that, then we wouldn't have made much progress towards Enoch's original point. And perhaps we would have made some progress, but I agree we would have made very little. But I think the point is that we see that only in this way we can solve the original problem.
Okay, the next person on my list is Tobias Rosefeld at the very back.
Yeah, thank you, Erasmus. My question is a kind of follow-up. I was wondering whether your solution creates an ambiguity of talk about the unavoidability of the question. What should I do? Because I think in one sense, a question might be unavoidable if I cannot but ask myself the question, but then it might also be unavoidable if I cannot but try to answer it. And I simply don't see why the question is unavoidable in the second sense. It might be that it is just there, we just as half-heartedly has a stance to answering the question as we had half-heartedly, according to Enoch, the stance of being an agent.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And I mean, I said a little bit about the unavoidability of the question, but certainly not, not enough. And so I do think what does a lot of work, or what does the work is said, I mean, we cannot help taking this question seriously. And also, kind of like, once we do take it seriously, there is some real issue of what we should do. And so, I mean, could you just ignore the question of what you should do? And so I do think we are psychologically incapable of that. So that's one part. But I also think that once we do take it seriously, then it's right that we should take it seriously. Then there is a real problem. There is, however, one other point which I think I didn't raise in the talk, but there is also one important structural difference to the Enoch case. Because so the idea really is that you are faced with this problem once you are an agent. But this doesn't mean that you are only faced with this problem of answering this question qua agent. So that you also have this hedged or restricted need. But that's something that worries you, so to speak, point, full stop. And so I do think that if something worries you, if something is a real problem for you, then you should resolve it, yes.
All right.
I mean, of course, perhaps it turns out that the best thing to do is to ignore it, but even to ignore is something you do. Sometimes you should ignore it. But I mean, even this is a fact about what you should do.
Okay.
But you don't like being stuck with this question.
Well, I'm sure you can continue the discussion over pretzels. The next question's at the very front here. And I may have missed some hands on this side of the room. So if you did raise your hand and you're sitting over here, yes, okay, now I've got you, thank you. There you go.
Okay, a little bit of devil's advocacy here. So suppose that, well, how do the normative standards of football get a grip on me? One might say, well, if you intend to play football, you set out to play football, then you have to do this sort of thing, so you're not doing it. Now, in the case of this sort of general, this normative question, one observation is that I actually never asked myself, what should I do, period. The kind of questions that I ask are more like, should I eat Thai food or vegan or whatever? Of course, the same sort of considerations come into play. But maybe when you kind of focus on these concrete questions that we ask, it's clearer that it's possible for me to answer that question or such questions without setting out to answer them well or reliably or responsibly or rationally. So it seems that even if the question is normative, a normative question of some sort of is unavoidable, it doesn't seem like I have to intend or somehow set out to answer it in a way that makes use of the rational capacities and therefore subject myself to the standards that may be implicit in their use. Because I can just, go to one of those restaurants and as you yourself point out, I don't need to do that.
And I think that's a very good point, but I think it relies on the idea, that's the only way they can get a grip on us is by our somehow intending to do X or somehow intending to subject us to S. And I don't think that's true. So, if you think of these, even of the humdrum cases, so you have a problem and you only have certain ways to follow it to solve this problem because you only have certain abilities, certain capacities. Then I think you do have a reason to kind of apply these capacities, use these capacities, and to follow their constitutive standards, whether or not you intend to do so. So take my earlier case of swimming. So even if that's the only way to cross the river, and I have to cross the river now. And so in this case, I think I have a good reason to start swimming. And I also then have a good reason to follow the constitutive standards for swimming. So I make strokes in a certain way. And I think I have this reason already even before I have taken any intention to swim or to follow the constitutive standards. I think it's a reason which is prior to, which just arises from the need to solve the problem and doesn't arise from the fact that I've committed myself to these standards by intending.
It's strictly necessary there for me to swim to cross the river, but in this case, it's not strictly necessary for me to make use of my rational capacities and so on to answer the question. I can answer it irresponsibly.
No, and that is true. But the point, I think I think one point where you're absolutely right is that one can kind of question Korsgaard's understanding of the initial question. Because I think she has a much richer understanding of it, which is not just that you settle what you do, but also in a way which you can reflectively endorse. And I entirely agree, and that actually makes it possible to act badly on this view, that you can answer the question what to do in a way which leads to action, but which isn't it doesn't fulfill the second condition. So which isn't such that you could on reflection endorse or accept what you were doing. So I entirely agree with that. But still, I think in this case, if Korsgaard is right, that the original question arises in this manner that we want a solution to it, which we can reflectively endorse, I think since the original question just isn't resolved.
Next question to the lady in the yellow jacket.
Yes, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. In fact, maybe this happens all the time, but I was very pleasantly surprised that you used the exact same Korsgaard quote to solve this problem that I use in a paper I just published on this. And I was like, yes, maybe this is true for 10 people in this room, but I was like, this is such a wonderful quote, but it is kind of problematic with this.
The problem-solving quote, or?
The problem-solving quote.
Yeah.
But I also argue in that paper that I don't think it gets us below the agency stuff. I didn't do the capacities thing, but my worry is just that inescapability, regardless of what you apply it to, doesn't solve the problem. So in the Korsgaard case, I would say inescapability, or let's put it another way, Louise Hansen has this wonderful paper where she distinguishes, I don't think it's published, but it's at the Aristotelian Society, where she distinguishes jurisdictional and normative inescapability, and what you want is clearly normative inescapability, the normative oomph. But it just, this is in the same direction as the other stuff here. It's not clear to me that putting capacities or abilities there gets us the normative inescapability that you get from something, yeah.
So I think, thank you very much for the question. So I think what gets us to the normative inescapability, is we don't get there without this idea about the reality of the problem. And that's also why very, very clearly this kind of constitutivism I like will not get us from is to ought, so to speak, because we are already starting with something normatively laden. And so it's not simply the mere fact that we bring in capacities, but rather I think this makes it natural to then think about these ways capacities normally function in our deliberation about what to do. And I think they just very, very often do give rise to constraints and requirements because they circumscribe how we can solve certain problems or how we can do things that have to be done. So I mean, but I do agree. No.
Okay, good. We won't get through everybody anyway. The next question goes to the gentleman sitting on K07. Yes, that's you, exactly. Maybe I should just go by numbers.
Oh, thank you very much. It was a brilliantly interesting talk. But there's a philosophical problem that at least is similar to schmagency. And perhaps regarding capacities in your other work, you answered it elsewhere. But I'm sure vast majority of people in this room are familiar with, I don't know, sections 142 to 242 of Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, what, Kripke's Wittgenstein's on Rules in Private Language is based on. You see in Wittgenstein's case somebody actually engaging in attempting to get somebody to check and correct their calculations correctly. But, using it from the Kripke vantage point, does the person, if we have the recalcitrant adder, or don't even take the recalcitrant adder, each of us, we think we have a capacity to add, but there are infinitely many numbers we couldn't even process. What determines that I have a capacity to add as opposed to quad, where quadding would have me go in a totally different direction if I got to some very large set of numbers and just start answering 5, 5, 5, 5. So I guess a permutation or determinacy problem with respect to capacities, which really matters for the normative question because you would get entirely different dictates as to what you ought to do as opposed to maybe merely descriptive adequacy considerations. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on, I don't think it's like a knockdown here. I can actually see resources you could appeal to, but it would be interesting to hear what you have to say about it.
No, thank you very much for this question. So I think really the problem which you kind of mentioned from like the philosophical investigation is a different one. It's a very different one from the Enoch problem. But this is perhaps my tendentious interpretation of Enoch and perhaps my too charitable interpretation for Enoch. So I think like kind of if you take Enoch, so to speak, as his word and take really this kind of like would-be mentioned seriously, I think the objection is not a good one. I don't think it can be well formulated. But I do think there is this perfectly legitimate underlying worry about like this explanatory is a step in the constitutivist explanation. How do we get from normativity qua X to normativity to cour or sans phrase? I think that's a perfectly good question. And I do not think that's just the same problem that is addressed in the passages from the philosophical investigations. Of course, I should also say that what we do, or what I have tried to do here, is in part like moving certain problems from moral theory and perhaps even like meta-ethics to questions like in metaphysics. And of course, this doesn't mean that these questions in metaphysics which arise there just now kind of are all solved. And of course, it is kind of like a very valid problem, for instance, how we are to individuate capacities, also the epistemological problem, how we know when someone has a capacity or which capacity he's exercising at the moment. These are all like perfectly good further questions. But I think, well, alas, when we move the problem to another area, some problems arise there too. But I think what I wouldn't think is like that the Enoch problem about agency versus agency is at bottom kind of like the Wittgensteinian problem or the Kripke-Wittgenstein problem about whether we are using plus or plus.
Right. Next question is Benjamin Kiesewetter.
Thank you, Erasmus. So this is a question about the ambition of the project. So inputs of the kind of constitutivist stories are the question, what should I do? Which kind of seems to presuppose that there are facts of the matter about what we should do. There's also the capacity to answer that question, the capacity to deliberate, which I find hard to understand other than as a capacity to weigh reasons, normative reasons. So do you accept that there are these facts about what we should do and facts about what we have reason to do, which are not really explained by a constitutivist story and which you can use then to plug into your constitutivist story about something, some other normative facts? Is that the view? Or do you have the ambition to also provide a constitutivist story about facts about what we should do and what we have reason to do? And if the latter, then I have some circularity worries.
Yeah. No, it's a very good question. So, I mean, I personally don't think just an aside, so to speak, that this kind of story provides you a general story about what reasons there are. So I think it's a more kind of limited story that you start with some reasons, but then you get to another interesting set of reasons or principles, what I would call principles. However, I do actually think the story itself is in an interesting or a nice way neutral about whether there are reason facts which are independent from like our capacities. So whether there are, so to speak, any independent facts. Because I think as you know, kind of Korsgaard is not just a constitutivist, but as one also puts, like a constructivist. So she thinks that normative facts are not discovered, but somehow constructed by our deliberation procedures and reflection procedures. And I don't think the story I have told is actually committed to that, because you might think what we do when we deliberate is actually we find out which facts there are. So we do find out independently existing facts about what we should do. Still, the ways in which we can find them out are constrained by the capacities we have. And therefore, these capacities kind of provide these, give rise to these normative requirements. So I actually think that the story I told here is kind of like compatible both with this kind of more constructivist position that Korsgaard herself is favoring, but also with a realist position about normative facts. But yeah.
Next question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I wonder if the basis of your explanation is not already in tradition, and it's not named as constitutivism, but it's simply natural law of action from Aristotle via Thomas and Pufendorf. So there are some constraints of action. For example, it must be intentional, and if it goes on in time and space, there must be some external movement of the body, and so on. This is the first point. And the second point of my question is, if you go to, can you give 15? I think it's 15. The question is always where comes where's a problem to be real? Yeah, recognize the problem to be real. If you recognize the problem to be real, I think if you do this, it implies I should solve the problem by mental activities. And then you have the should in you. But this is a decision that you recognize it as real. And so you put in here is a should in your story. So you have this is follow-up to the other questions, going from a factual decision of a person to this should, and it's not that you can bring the should in another way, or it is constitutive.
Thank you very much. So this it means like here from the Korsgaard quotes, is if you recognize the problem to be real. And I think for Korsgaard, this cannot mean that if you recognize that there's an independent fact that the problem is real. She cannot think that. And this has precisely to do with this kind of constructivist project that she has. So she thinks kind of like facts about what problems we should pursue, these we arrive on only at the very end. These are not part of the input into our procedure. Now for the first question. So I do think one can connect this absolutely to the natural law tradition, but this tradition, as you know yourself, is very manifold. And I don't think there's perhaps an even stronger part of this tradition is a more like Thomistic and Aristotelian tradition, which somehow derives these the natural laws from facts about human nature and what we are. And interestingly, on this tradition, it is not necessarily that we somehow recognize this in deliberation. These are just like facts about human nature that, the great philosophers have recognized, but which it's not the fact that every agent for himself must really understand him and sees him like this. And I am kind of skeptical, or very skeptical about this tradition of the natural law. So I don't really think there is like a somehow independently determined good for the human being, which is somehow is not something that we work out or we determine as individuals. By contrast, there's also, you might say, like a more Kantian version of the natural law. And actually this is much more germane to that. And there's even like a I'm now kind of unavoidably looking into Tobias Roosevelt's direction, because there's even like a reading of Kant and even of Kant's theoretical philosophy, which is actually very similar, which also thinks that we start with certain problems and with rational capacities, and the principles we have in theoretical philosophy just actually derive from these capacities or faculties, Vermögen, how Kant would call them. So which, for instance, thinks in ways the categories, the principles connected to the categories, arise from the fact that we somehow unify our experience, or the impressions we have, into one experience, and we just have certain capacities like the understanding and imagination to do this. And therefore, like the principles for these capacities, like the understanding, the categories, are binding for us in theoretical cognition. So it is kind of, I think, much closer to this kind of like Kantian project, or at least kind of as one way to understand the Kantian project. Sorry.
It's fitting that we end with a very short question, because we have to finish on time, from a metaphysician. Christina, please.
Thanks. It's a really quick follow-up on the last question answer. So if that is the view, where do the principles come from? I mean, in a Kantian picture, you have kind of logic, which is cut into marble, but nowadays we wouldn't think these ways. So where do the principles come from if they're invariant?
Okay, you have 1 minute to answer that.
So where does the principle, but could I just like to clarify, because acoustically I didn't get the middle part, I'm very sorry for that. So you mean kind of like we today wouldn't think there is this kind of cut in stone or fixed for how we could get to principles. And I think actually this general model is kind of like flexible enough to allow for that, because it allows for kind of, you might say, hierarchy of principles, some of which are more general, because they are needed to like answer this general question, what should we do? But very often the question, what should we do, arises in a much more specific context and in a much more like specific setting. And then, of course, like all these different aspects of the setting also become constraints on how we can reach an answer to this question. And therefore, we have much more specific principles, which may also differ from context. So I do think at least the general scheme is flexible to allow for the point you made.
And we are almost perfectly on time. I have I'm strictly commanded to make us leave the room on time so it can be prepared for the members' assembly. So thank you so much, Erasmus. And everybody, you'll find the Erkenntnis reception just outside the door, where I'm sure you can continue the discussion.